Hi, everybody. Welcome.
What's going on?
Hi, everybody.
We're just going to let a couple people more in before we begin. Just a couple more people are coming in.
Question. So there's no PDF available, but I'm gonna put the link in the chat for the ebook. That's $6 on Haymarket. And I would highly suggest getting it. The actual physical copy of the book is really far back ordered right now, which is amazing. But the ebook you can download within like a minute. And just for everyone coming in right now, we've decided we're going to spend the first 10 minutes just hanging out and embroidering, or just hanging out if you don't have anything to embroider or craft. So feel free to talk and
Show us what you're working on.
yeah. Ooh, that's beautiful.
Thank you.
What is that?
Maybe it'll be a sweater.
Yeah.
I'm just playing with the yarn in my collection.
Nice.
No, I've conceived of a new project to do an embroidery based on my prime number thing. So I have to go and buy myself some embroidery hoops and threads.
That's so exciting.
That's great.
Do you have an accessible way to explain that to us, what you're going to be doing, or?
Well, I can show you some drawings of. I'll show you.
Chrissy.
Chrissy's in the background. I'll show. It was like the drawings that I showed you last week, but it's interesting because they're a way of representing numbers. But I've realized that they also relate to a kind of mathematics, which is the mathematical study of knots. And in mathematics, knots are a huge topic of study, but very difficult. And it turns out that these drawings that I've done, they all represent knots. And I've figured out, so I thought, well, I'd actually embroider them and show the mathematicians that they actually really are these knot structures.
That's super exciting.
But I have to, hey, do you guys know, is Michael's open? Can you go and buy things at Michael's, or do I have to order my hoops?
We're happy to send, we're supplying embroidery hoops and thread, so we can send it up to you.
Oh, thank you, Lauren. That would be amazing.
Of course, it's our pleasure.
Thank you.
Direct message me or put on the chat bar what colors you want.
Oh, thank you.
And I'll get it to you soon. Or I'm going to be at the studio tomorrow, so I can even drop it by on my way home.
Oh, thank you, Lauren. That would be fabulous. I've got a color scheme in mind.
Okay, just on the chat bar, tell me what you want.
Okay. And Chrissy says to say hello. She's doing stretching in the background. She's been crocheting up a storm. She's crocheting things out of videotape at the moment.
Oh my God.
Oh, that's awesome.
Wow.
Actually, Chrissy, go and get your thing to show. This is show and tell.
Tell them if anybody has a favourite movie and they can get it on videotape.
Oh, Chrissy says if anybody has a favourite movie and they can get it on VHS tape, she'd be happy to crochet it for you. She's been crocheting E.T. at the moment.
Wow.
It's actually really hard to get your favourite movies and video anymore.
I might have to send you Wayne's World.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we wanted to do. We both like Keanu Reeves, so we finally managed to find a copy of Bill and Ted. So Chrissy's going to crochet that.
I have a set of Thomas the Tank Engine.
Oh,
Then you don't mind.
can you
Just say it's a movie a friend of ours made.
Oh, look
can
at
you
that.
see this?
That is
This is
amazing.
this is a movie that a friend of ours made, so we're going to give it to him.
Oh, wow, that's beautiful.
We loved your movie. Here it is.
We love your movie. Yeah. What are you crochet? What are you embroidering, Roxanne?
I'm doing a corn.
Oh, beautiful.
Are you still doing, is that the same corn that we saw before, Roxanne?
Yeah, I've been savoring the last, like, it's almost done. So
I want to pin your,
There you go.
I love that texture you have on the corn.
Baptista Intergalactic Space Program.
Oh,
Excellent.
I'm just starting a new one tonight, but I finished, I'm doing that onion. I think
let's
it's,
see, do you have it?
I've actually hung it on the wall before I send it back to you guys. I don't know if you'll be able to see it because it's kind of a light color, but that's
I love it. Pretty.
Wait, I want to pin it. Hold on, so I can see.
that an onion? I wasn't sure. I didn't draw this one.
I think it's an onion, and it looks like the world. I love it.
Yeah.
What was I thinking? And then I'm going to be working on the pen steaming. Which looks like this. Currently.
I love that one.
And what
can
do
you show that again, Maya? I couldn't see it very well.
Oh, it's a pen steaming flower, and
Oh, lovely.
it's just a drawing for now, but I'm going to be embroidering.
Mm-hmm. Maya, can I ask you practically, do you have to put the drawing on before you stretch it on the hoop or after you stretch it on the hoop?
Well, the way that, if anyone else wants to answer that too, there are more folks in here who've been working on the embroideries, but when Ryan and I make our own embroideries, like our own sketches, we normally put the hoop on first to stretch out the fabric, and then we draw on. But for these, because they had them printed and then sent out, I believe y'all probably didn't have the hoop on when you printed them. I'm assuming. Right, Jen?
You're on mute, I think. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I was reading the chat.
Oh, that's okay. I was just answering Margaret's question about, I don't think you have the hoop on when you printed these, right?
You don't have to have the hoop on to embroider?
Or when you printed the image onto the...
Oh, no, you don't have to have the hoop on when you're printing it.
Because that actually went through the printer.
But if you're going to draw something yourself, do you recommend doing the drawing before or after you put it on the hoop?
Well, I think if you're gonna, do you have a light table or because I was gonna say if you're gonna use the window, you could tape the drawing and then tape the fabric to it to keep it taut, and then draw it that way. Whereas I think if you had the hoop, it would be harder to hold it up to the light.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Yeah.
If anybody wants a pattern, we have 20 different patterns that of different native plants that we're working with at Metabolic Studio, and we'll load them on the chat bar. And if you'd like us to mail you one, let us know. Otherwise, feel free to do your own thing. But we're happy to get you involved with our representation of native plants from the area past, and supply you with the kit.
Hi, Louise.
Hi, sweetheart. How are
Hi,
you?
Louise.
Hi, Warren. I can't find where I put down my crocheting. I think it must be in my car.
Uh-oh. That's like the dog ate your homework.
Just about. I'm so excited to see everybody.
Well, tonight we were thinking of just letting folks trickle in for a while and then we'd start reading. And Rachel had written out this beautiful introduction. So maybe I'll start reading that over if that sounds good to everyone.
Oh my, Chrissy just had a lovely suggestion. She actually went after your session last week, which we both were very impressed with. We went and read the 13th Amendment, which Chrissy says is only like 2 sentences, and she wants to embroider it.
Oh, wow.
Oh, that's
Good
wonderful.
idea.
I read the 13th Amendment again today, and I remember you talking about how people could be punished and convicted of crimes, and crimes could be as little as something of being offensive. And looking at this from a legal point of view, that's a violation of the First Amendment of the Constitution because it's vague and it's overbroad. It's vague because people can be offended for all sorts of reasons, and it's overbroad because it covers protected speech. So I thought that was interesting. And I also appreciate your heads up about watching 13th. I watched it immediately after the meeting and was just really bowled away.
Oh, I'm so glad to hear that. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, thank you.
It was interesting for us, Maya, to hear about the history of how in America it went from slavery to effectively a convict system. Because in Australia, we didn't have slavery, but our nation was built on convict labor. And most of the convicts who were sent to Australia were petty, just poor people from Britain and Ireland who were convicted of things like stealing a loaf of bread and then sent to Australia for 20 years hard labor.
Yeah.
Right.
So very, very interesting. I didn't realize until you had that thing last week how much the slavery system had just evolved into effectively a convict system.
Yeah. Pretty nuts.
Yeah.
I'm going to start reading over this intro. Hello, so glad to see you all again. Welcome to the Abolitionist Reading and Native Plant Embroidery Zoom gathering hosted by the Metabolic Studio. I just wanted to give a brief introduction and give a little bit of context on how we all found ourselves here at 6:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, or where we are in Vermont, it's 9:30 on a Friday evening. So the Metabolic Studio is located in downtown Los Angeles and is the practice of the artist Lauren Bond. Since 2016, Lauren has been conducting a community evening and potluck series right after the last presidential election, when it became necessary for us to come together and create a space to voice what was going on in our communities and how we were all being impacted by the current administration. Over the last 4 years, this has evolved. The Thursday always started with a potluck and included message making in our printmaking workshop. The practice of coming together once a week has also included many handcrafts with community members working with clay, weaving, and doing embroidery. So tonight we have you all here to do embroidery while we listen to me and Ryan, and I believe tonight Livia and another Maya are going to help us read. And if anyone else is interested, the ebook is available on Haymarket's website. I'll put the link in the chat for $6. A short overview regarding the embroidery. Many of you have already received embroidery kits in the mail, and for those of you who are interested in receiving a kit, please email Jen Curtis from the team, and we will mail a kit to you. Jen, maybe you could put the email in the chat if that's okay. In the kit will be a line drawing on fabric of a botanical plant, which is part of the food and medicine that the Metabolic Studio is currently growing on its studio sites. And Lauren has catalyzed a bunch of gardens in various different sites in and outside of Los Angeles, but the two places where we're currently growing food and medicine in downtown LA are along the LA River, Metabolic Studio itself, where the printmaking workshop is, and across the river on a site we call the Moon. We are also growing food and medicine up in the Owens Valley, which is the source of the water that comes to Los Angeles via the LA Aqueduct. And we're also growing food in Vermont. So we took images and made these drawings from the food and native plants we're growing, transferred those onto fabric, which we sent to those of you who are interested, along with an embroidery hoop, needles, and thread. And in the kit, you also should have received a self-addressed return envelope with postage. So when you've finished your embroidery, you can use this to mail it back to us, and it will eventually get stitched into a larger community quilt that will be exhibited in the future and accessible on our website. I know many of you have been in contact with Jen, so continue to take any direction from her as she has been coordinating all the email exchanges with you. And this was designed as a time to be together when we cannot physically be together, and to create an opportunity for us to talk and exchange ideas while using our hands to do something creative. And a week after we had hosted our initial embroidery circle, the whole world changed. The witnessing of the murder of George Floyd broadcasted across the globe while in the middle of a lockdown during a global pandemic. You know, things were very quickly becoming drastically different. So we collectively decided to try to rethink how we can do better and how we can become, you know, better accomplices in the movement for Black lives. And one of the ways we've decided to tackle this is to educate ourselves and our community, and to really discuss something that the movement for Black lives and Black Lives Matter specifically is discussing right now, which is prison abolition, and how we can educate ourselves on prison abolition and this abolition discussion around police abolition, because there has been so many decades of research and work and literature and organizing around prison abolition that we can really tap into and learn from. So the goal is to really focus right now and educate ourselves. So we are going to read tonight From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation by Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, and we're going to be focusing on chapter 2. I'm trying to find where I have to read it on my computer. Okay, and chapter 2 is entitled From Civil Rights to Colorblind. And this is an important chapter to give an overview of, you know, how we've kind of arrived where we are right now since the civil rights movement, which I thought was a good thing to put at the beginning of this 12-week syllabus, because it'll give us some perspective that might be really helpful moving forward. So something, just housekeeping, if any of y'all would just like to embroider and discuss and have conversation amongst yourselves, we are going to open a breakout room where you can just go to hang out. Jen, maybe if it would be possible to send that breakout invite now so people know that they can join it. And if you don't want to join it now, if you'd rather be in the reading room, you can just click not now, I think it maybe says later or something. Is that right, Jen? Yes.
Yes, I'm gonna set it up right now.
Awesome. So you'll get an invite to join a breakout room. You can click join, where you'll just be able to embroider and hang out. You can also click later, where you will stay here, and then you will have the option to leave when you'd like and come back when you'd like. And the goal with that is to also encourage people to, you know, have discussions around embroidery and craft making and just be able to create community together right now. Also, I want to make it very, you know, clear that we are reading really intense literature and it's a heavy moment. So please feel free to utilize that space to debrief. And we will also have discussion at the end. But something that's important to note is that there are a couple content warnings in the reading tonight. One of them is a pretty graphic description of the Attica uprising and the murders that ensued from, you know, prison violence. And we'll let you know. Okay, so you might have just gotten the invite to join the breakout room. I'm gonna click later, and you'll have the option to join it afterwards, after you click later. So there's that description. We'll let you know before we'll read it, so that if anyone wants to leave, you can go to the breakout room. If anyone wants to mute your sound, you can do that. Or if you'd like to hear it, you're more than welcome to hear it. And then also just another content warning, the N-word is used in this reading. As white people, I'm not gonna say that word. I'm gonna say the N-word. And I encourage all other white folks and non-Black people of color to not say that word. And just to let you all know, that'll be in the reading. So now I'll leave it open for questions for a second. If anyone's curious about if it's not clear how to join the breakout room, I can describe that. All right. So Maya and Livia, are you wanting to still read tonight?
Yes.
Okay, great. So maybe what we can do is Ryan and I will start, and then we'll bounce it over to Livia, and then Livia can bounce it to Maya, and then Maya, you can bounce it to Ryan. Cool.
You want me to start or you're
Yeah.
going to go?
You start. Could you move it?
No, very good at speaking to them.
All right. Our setup is a little weird on our end. I forgot my computer, so I'm reading the chapter on top of the Zoom meeting. So if any of you are giving me wild hand gestures or anything to get my attention, I'm not going to be able to see you for a second. And I'm sorry. But just yell, "Hey!" and I'll move the chapter. All right, chapter 2, From Civil Rights to Colorblind. This is a quote to start off the chapter. If the problem of the 20th century was, in W.E.B. Du Bois' famous words, quote, the problem of the color line, then the problem of the 21st century is the problem of colorblindness, the refusal to acknowledge the causes and consequences of enduring racial stratification. Naomi Murakawa. All right. In this book, Black Reconstruction in America, W.E.B. Du Bois described the promise of Reconstruction as a, quote, brief moment in the sun for blacks before its disastrous end moved African Americans, quote, back again towards slavery. The receding of the Black Power insurgency during the 1970s didn't return blacks to a state of neo-slavery, but the hope and expectations raised by the movement of the 1960s proved elusive. By the end of the 1970s, there was little talk about institutional racism or the systemic roots of Black oppression. There was even less talk about the kind of movement necessary to challenge it. Instead, when Ronald Reagan ran the Republican presidential nomination in 1976, he made a play for the racist vote by complaining about a fictitious, quote, strapping young buck using food stamps to buy a T-bone steak. He famously invented the stereotypical, quote, welfare queen, who, he said, quote, used 80 names, 30 addresses, 15 telephone numbers to collect food stamps, social securities, veterans benefits for 4 non-existent deceased veterans' husbands, as well as welfare. Her tax-free cash income alone has been running $150,000 a year, end quote. These were familiar racist baits for white conservative electorate. Lazy, black, welfare cheats, getting something for nothing. But in the aftermath of the, quote, Black Revolution of the 1960s, politicians no longer felt comfortable displaying their racist credentials upon their sleeves. The, quote, strapping buck and the, quote, welfare queen were assumed to be black, but politically, Reagan and others could not risk saying so. Even with its coded language, Reagan's conservatism was at this point considered on the extreme right of mainstream politics. It would take the rest of the decade to become dominant. The black movement in the 1960s disgraced outward displays of racial animus, even as race continued to animate American politics by other means. Ultimately, Reagan lost the nomination to Gerald Ford by a narrow margin, but the trajectory of mainstream politics was clear. It was not just the right. The Democratic Party was also moving quickly to abandon its very recent association with the civil rights movement. On a campaign trail stop in Indiana, Jimmy Carter, who was campaigning for the 1976 Democratic nomination, remarked, quote, "I have nothing against a community that's made up of people who are Polish, Czechoslovakian, French Canadians, or blacks who are trying to maintain the ethnic purity of their neighborhoods. But I don't think the government ought to deliberately break down an ethically oriented community, deliberately by injecting into it a number of another race. I'm not trying to say that I want to maintain with any kind of government interference in ethnic purity of neighborhoods. What I say is the government ought not to take a major purpose, sorry, what I say is the government ought not to take as a major purpose the intrusion of alien groups into neighborhoods simply to establish that intrusion." End quote. The country was entering an era of post-civil rights, quote, colorblindness. This was not the benign, long-sought absence of race from the legal structures governing the United States. The 1968 Kerner Commission reports detailed descriptions of racial discrimination by public and private institutions had established a basis upon which African Americans could stake a claim to federal aid. Instead, quote, colorblindness aided politicians in rolling back the welfare states, allowing Congress and the courts to argue that the absence of racism in the law meant that African Americans could not claim racial harm. Not everyone believed this, so soon after the black movement had turned the country upside down, demanding
something interesting.
But the political framework of colorblindness allowed portions of the political establishment to separate black hardship from the material conditions that activists had worked so hard to expose. It was as if the signing of civil rights legislation had wiped the slate clean and African Americans had been given a new start. Only 10 years earlier, Lyndon Johnson had given his speech declaring that, quote, freedom is not enough, end quote, to achieve racial equality, but now those vying for the presidency were contending that formal freedom was more than enough. Nothing could have been further from the truth. Decades of disinvestment and under-resourcing had left African Americans surrounded by substandard and dilapidated housing, poor job options, underfunded schools, and a bevy of other problems that only massive financial investment could repair. The politics of colorblindness helped to shroud not only racism, but its companion, the economic crisis of the early 1970s. At the precise moment when the black movement was demanding enormous infrastructural investment to revive urban enclaves, the booming American economy of the post-war era was grinding to a halt. With its end came a relentless ideological assault on the kinds of public expenditures needed to attend to deep economic deprivation. Colorblindness helped to explain this retreat from the public expenditure as the consequence of moral decay and the rise of criminality in the, quote, inner city. Nixon cabinet member George Romney would describe it as the, quote, crisis problem people, end quote, using the old, quote, culture of poverty framework that framework that the movement had pilloried. How do you say that word? Pilloried in the 1960s. The point was to restore order while defanging continued black demands on the state. These kinds of political attacks had persisted throughout the 1960s as the right hardened its political opposition to civil rights and welfare legislation. The difference then, however, was that the strength of the movement in both its southern and northern expressions, exerted a tremendous amount of pressure on the federal government to make repeated concessions.
The end of the long post-war economic boom, along with a slowing Black political movement, created the first opportunity in a long while for the political right wing to recalibrate and take the offensive. American politics had been deeply polarized for much of the 60s, but relentless protests had effectively thwarted the right's efforts to demobilize the movement. The racial common sense underwriting the, quote, culture of poverty had been severely compromised by the Black movement and its demands for full citizenship and an end to racial discrimination. It was hard to argue that people putting their lives in harm's way for the right to vote were, quote, culturally defective. Not only was the Black movement a threat to the racial status quo, but it also acted as a catalyst for many other mobilizations against oppression. From the anti-war movement to the struggle for women's liberation, the Black movement was a conduit for questioning American democracy and capitalism. Its generative power provided a focal point for the counteroffensive that was soon to come. This counteroffensive, launched by the business class, would affect not only Blacks, but everyone who benefited from the expansion of social welfare. This alone was enough to galvanize the right and all of mainstream politics. It was one thing to identify a political need to absorb some portion of African Americans into the mainstream of society, including through access to middle-class jobs, homeownership, higher education, and electoral politics. It was quite another to continue to acquiesce to Black demands in a way that threatened to compromise core ideological tenets of American capitalism, including the image of the United States as a land of equal opportunity, not, quote, equal outcomes. The battle in the 60s had legitimized Black demands. Now that legitimacy had to be rolled back. In 1981, Republican Party strategist Lee Atwater explained how this was to be done and the role that colorblind politics could play. You could start out in 1954 by saying N-word, N-word, N-word. By 1968, you can't say N-word. That hurts you, backfires. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff, and you're getting so abstract. This is a quote, by the way, by Lee Atwater. Now you're talking about cutting taxes, and all these things you're talking about are totally economic things, and a byproduct of them is Blacks get hurt worse than whites. Quote, we want to cut this, is much more abstract than even the busing thing, and a hell of a lot more abstract than N-word, N-word, end quote. That's from 81.
It's from a Republican Party strategist.
It is important to consider that this political attack was intended not only to discipline rebelling African Americans, but to reestablish order in a society where demonstrations, illegal strikes, riots, and rebellion had become legitimate means of registering complaints, including those of ordinary working class white people against the state and forcing reforms from hostile political forces. This chapter explores the ideological and political restoration of order in efforts to rehabilitate the system itself.
I just want to hop in here and say that Maya and I read this chapter, and there's that great Mark Twain quote that's something like, history never repeats itself, but sometimes it rhymes. This is exactly one of those moments in history that we're about to get into that is not perfectly, but is very similar to what's happening today.
Understanding the, quote, conservative backlash, end quote. Richard Nixon's victory in 1968 signaled that not everyone was pleased with the radicalism sweeping across the United States. Nixon articulated the anxiety experienced by many white workers who chafed at the pace at which Blacks were demanding change. He especially embodied the anger of a ruling class that wanted to reestablish control over the direction of the country. This meant ending street protests as well as curtailing public sector programs and work. The reassertion of Republican control began with binding the loose threads of the party. The GOP had been deeply divided for most of the 60s among the hardcore Goldwater right, the buttoned-up business elite of the Northeastern Corridor, and the liberal civil rights wing of the party. The tumult of social upheaval and the war in Vietnam had blown the existing Democratic Party apart, leaving its segregationist Dixiecrat wing without a home. This gave GOP an opening to reestablish itself as the political home for conservatives, including the racist Southerners displaced by the Democratic Party. Integrating the Dixiecrats into the GOP was central to a broader strategy the Republicans referred to as the, quote, Southern strategy, which at its core was about winning white Democrats, particularly poor and working class Democrats, to the Republican Party on the basis of racism. The Southern strategy was contingent on two assumptions: that the Democratic Party would implode across the South, and that Republicans could appeal to the racism and resentment of white workers, whom they presumed were chafing at what blacks were gaining through protest. Nixon referred to all of these potential voters as the silent majority, insinuating that those protesting for civil rights and against the war in Vietnam were a vocal minority. In 1969, Nixon advisor Kevin Phillips wrote a book entitled The Emerging Republican Majority, which essentially argued that elections are won by focusing on people's resentments. Nixon, once in office, mapped out a strategy to do just that, transforming ordinary whites' anxieties brought on by growing economic insecurity into resentment against blacks. Nixon's chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman, said as much in his diary of daily events in the White House. He wrote that Nixon had, quote, emphasized that you have to face the fact that the whole problem is really the blacks. The key is to devise a system that recognizes this while not appearing to, end quote. That is a quote by Nixon. Just want to reiterate, that is a quote. Incredible.
By Halderman, I think.
Yes, sorry. Yes,
who was very close to Nixon.
He wrote that Nixon had, okay, yes, you're right. So, but he's quoting that that is what Nixon was doing.
Yeah, totally.
There was a grain of truth to this. The Black movement was the nexus of social protest throughout the 60s. King recognized as much in the months before he was killed. In these trying circumstances, this is a quote by King. In these trying circumstances, the Black Revolution is much more than a struggle for the rights of Negroes. It is forcing America to face all its interrelated flaws: racism, poverty, militarism, and materialism. It is exposing the evils that are rooted deeply in the whole structure of society, end quote. From the movement against the war in Vietnam to a revived movement for women's liberation, new struggles were unfolding. The gay liberation movement came into being with the riot in New York City in the summer of 1969. A strike wave in the late 1960s and early 1970s had even greater repercussions in American politics. Nixon's strategy for responding was an old one: divide and conquer. Olivia, I'm kicking it off to you.
Okay. That strategy, however, would take some time to develop. When Nixon was elected, the country was deeply divided. The last great gasp of urban rebellion came in the spring of 1968, in the aftermath of King's assassination. But the nation's elected officials did not know this in the early 1970s and assumed that more was around the corner. The threat of violence, which had propelled social policy for the better part of a decade, still hung thick in the air. Non-white communities were having enough skirmishes with the police that Nixon had to temper his desire to cut social welfare. San Francisco Mayor Joseph Alito reminded his colleagues in 1974 that, quote, there are emotions in the cities that can be as disruptive as 1967, 1968, 1969, and it would be a serious mistake to think the cities cannot erupt. Nixon described the country as on the verge of unraveling and tapped into the resentments and anxieties of white workers, stirring generational resentments between older white workers and the students, Blacks, young workers, and radicals who were taking over the cities and the campuses. Rising crime, rising taxes, and inflation capped the long economic expansion of the post-war period. In the background, the war in Vietnam appeared endless and was on the verge of expanding. Nixon homed in on the uncertainty that ruled the moment and led a charge to link this national sense of insecurity to liberals and the pace at which Blacks were demanding even more. Part of the concern was that Black protests were not just affecting legislation, they were also having a direct influence on the economy. Workers' real wages were being eaten away by inflation, spawned by the war in Vietnam, while workplace conditions were getting worse. The demands of automation in many industries meant laying workers off and expecting those who remained to do more. Black auto workers in Detroit referred to this process as, quote, N-word-mation, describing how one Black worker was expected to be as productive as 3 white workers. The pace was grueling and the consequences were deadly, and the profits rolled in. According to one report, quote, in 1946, some 550,000 auto workers had produced a little more than 3 million vehicles. But in 1970, some 750,000 auto workers had produced a little more than 8 million vehicles. N-word-mation, Dan Georgakis and Marvin Sirkin explain in Detroit, I Do Mind Dying, was directly responsible for the deaths of more than 16,000 auto workers. One 1973 report found that, quote, 63,000 cases of disabling diseases and about 1.7 million cases of lost or impaired hearing. The demand for higher wages to offset the corrosive effects of inflation and compensate for the dramatic rise in production helped to spur workplace militancy. This put Black and white workers on the same picket lines. Workplace action also spread to the public sector, even while public sector strikes were illegal. After President John F. Kennedy signed an executive order in 1960 allowing federal workers to unionize, though not strike, public employee union membership grew from 400,000 in the late 1950s to 4 million by the mid-1970s. This opened up enormous access to good, stable jobs because anti-discrimination legislation ensured more fairness in public sector jobs than in private white-collar employment. However, the inability to strike often meant that federal workers, regardless of their ability to form unions, relied on welfare to supplement their take-home pay. By the mid-1960s, public sector workers were beginning to engage in illegal strikes to raise their wages and bring dignity to their workplaces. Poverty wages in garbage collection, nursing, teaching, mail delivery, and other public jobs prompted unprecedented and illegal workplace action. The most famous example is the sanitation workers in Memphis, whose attempts at organizing a union brought King to their city. He addressed them the night before he was murdered. Hundreds of thousands of African Americans had participated in social movement activism over the course of the 1960s, and they did not simply leave their politics at the door when they arrived at work. Instead, the struggle over social conditions in their neighborhoods catalyzed their struggles at work. In 1960, there had been 36 public sector strikes. By 1970, that number had grown to 412. Black sanitation workers and nurses went on strike across the South for union recognition and collective bargaining rights. Maya, do you want to read next?
The most dramatic episode of workplace activism during this era was an illegal strike of more than 200,000 postal workers in March 1970. For 2 weeks, postal workers in more than 30 cities refused to sort or deliver the mail. Instead, they walked the picket lines, demanding an increase in wages. The strike began in New York City, where the top salary postal workers could earn after 21 years of employment was still less than the average cost of living in the city. In 1968, President Johnson suggested to Congress a modest pay increase for postal workers. Congress took no action, but in 1970, it offered them a puny 4% raise, and a week later voted itself a 41% salary increase. The ensuing postal strike was the largest workplace action ever taken by federal workers. At one point, Nixon mobilized the National Guard to sort and deliver the mail. But postal work was hard, skilled work, and untrained soldiers could not easily perform it. The breakdown of discipline was palpable. Of the 26,000 soldiers called up to intervene in the strike, only 16,000 bothered to show. Within a matter of 2 weeks, the disproportionately Black postal workforce won a 14% wage increase and the unprecedented right to collectively bargain their wages. Nixon's labor secretary glumly noted, quote, "There's only one thing worse than an illegal strike, a wildcat that wins," end quote. Time magazine observed, quote, "The government's authority was placed in question and the well-being of business, institutions, and individuals in jeopardy," end quote. The postal strike was the crest of a wave of workplace actions from 1967 through 1974. During that period, there was an average of 5,200 strikes per year, compared with a high of 4,000 strikes in the previous decade. The number of workdays lost to strikes was also growing. From 1967 to 1971, strike days averaged 49.5 million, peaking during the year of the postal strike with 66.4 million days lost in 1970, the highest yearly loss due to labor unrest since 1946. It was no coincidence that this strike wave coincided with the most militant phase of the Black insurgency, and it affected the entire workforce, not just Black workers. This was the real threat. As labor journalist Lee Suster explains, quote, "Several Black caucuses, such as the Society of Afro-American Postal Employees, became centers of agitation for industrial struggle that necessarily involved white workers. Comprising over 20% of the 700,000 postal employees, Black workers were central to the week-long illegal wildcat postal strike in 1970. Black postal workers were concentrated in cities where the strike was strongest. Organized against the efforts of union leaders, the illegal walkout was broken only when President Richard Nixon sent in the National Guard. The strike, denounced as, quote, labor anarchy by the Wall Street Journal, almost certainly involved the largest number of Black workers ever in a US labor dispute, end quote. Black labor played a prominent role in the strike wave, but its success would have been impossible if millions of white workers had also not taken action. This fact challenges the assumption that white workers were politically monolithic, dutiful adherents to silent majority politics. It challenges the simplistic narrative of racial backlash pitting ordinary whites against the Black struggle. None of this is to say that many white workers were not racist during this period. Many were indeed resentful, perceiving that Blacks were getting too much at the expense of white families. The political drift to the right, however, was not linear. It was complicated by changing racial and economic dynamics and by the real impact of the Black Revolution throughout the entire country, which provoked or even hardened some resentments and anxieties, but also upended negative attitudes toward Blacks that were largely based in racist stereotypes. Black demands for inclusion, including access to the supposed benefits of American citizenship, subverted or at least confronted the idea that Blacks were lazy and parasitic. According to Barbara Ehrenreich, polls taken between 1965 and 1968 showed sharp increases in the number of people who said they, quote, often feel bad about the way, quote, Negroes are treated. The number of whites willing to vote for a Black president jumped from 38% in 1958 to 59% in 1965 to 70% in 1970. Polls found majorities in favor of affirmative action, against the death penalty, and for integrated neighborhoods. The numbers across the board were higher in the early 1970s than they would be even a few years later. This speaks to the powerful sway of the social movements of the 1960s, not to an unbridgeable gap between white and Black. Ehrenreich goes on to point out, quote, America's blue-collar workers were in revolt in the late 60s and 70s, but not along the right-wing traditionalist lines sketched by the media. The late 60s saw the most severe strike wave since shortly after World War II, and by the early 70s, the new militancy had swept up auto workers, rubber workers, steel workers, teamsters, city workers, hospital workers, farm workers, tugboat crewmen, grave diggers, and postal employees. For all the talk of racial backlash, Black and white workers were marching, picketing, and organizing together in a spirit of class solidarity that had not been seen since the 30s. Nixon's silent majority was yelling as loud as it could, not racial epithets, but the historic strikers' chant, "Don't cross the line," end quote. The growth of left-wing consciousness over the course of the 1960s helps to explain why Nixon turned to colorblindness and racial code words as a way to conceal, or at least obscure, later efforts to undo aspects of the Johnson welfare state. If the white majority were as racist as the conservative backlash narrative makes them out to be, then why this strategy of codes and subterfuge? There was never any national directive declaring an end to the use of racial epithets in the public utterances of elected officials. Nor had public displays of racism simply become unfashionable. Instead, the Black movement had rendered such behavior completely unacceptable, not least because it had demonstrated, some 50 years before the slogan would appear, that Black lives mattered. It has been the relative strength, or lack thereof, of the movement that would ultimately determine whether or not the public nature of racism would persist. By the end of the 60s and into the early 1970s, the movement made racism unpopular. By the end of the decade, this would begin to change. Ryan, do you want to take over?
Thank you. That's great. In addition, Nixon could not unleash a frontal assault on the Johnson welfare state because poor and ordinary whites were also benefiting from the war on poverty. This foreshadowed a strategy that Reagan and Clinton would employ as well, using racial codes and innuendo to build a case against programs that benefit poor and working class whites, while undermining the potential for solidarity among those who have the most to gain by uniting and the most to lose by continuing to be divided. These were the politics of race in the new, quote, post-racial era. Restoring order. In 1969, Life magazine published a series of articles on revolution. One front cover read, quote, "Revolution, what are the causes? How does it start? Can it happen here?" End quote. It may read as a conspiracy theory today, but by the late 1960s, these were serious questions confronting the elite, what today we regularly refer to as the 1%. This was not an anti-communist rant, but evidence of genuine concern of the rising fortunes of the left. The Wall Street Journal raised similar questions in the wake of the militant student activism overseas, openly wondering what impact the protests would have in this country. Quote, "In a modern world reduced to the size of a village by high-speed communications, it is possible to mobilize an international following with such an attractive idea, whether it is possible to foment a worldwide revolution with enough force to destroy the existing balance of power and order is a debatable topic, but this is no doubt the puzzling question that is in the back of the minds of many people when they see on their TV screens the forces of disorder at work." End quote. This continued worry about radicalization was coupled with a looming concern about the state of the economy. The core concern here was not about the economic health of the average American, rather, quote, "Capitalists in the early 70s felt threatened by the changes in the world economy, by the decline of American hegemony, and by the consequences of the implications of domestic political mobilizations," end quote. When a New York Times journalist and a graduate student were allowed to sit in on a series of retreats for business executives in 1974 and 1975, quote, they found a mood of vulnerability and a concern about the long-range implications of recent social and economic policies, end quote. In their book, Ethics and Profits, The Crisis of Confidence in American Business, Leonard Silk and David Bogle conducted a wide-ranging survey of 360 anonymous executives from some of the most powerful corporations in the nation about their attitudes concerning the health of business and free enterprise. They found a range of emotions, from anxiety to contempt, directed at the great mass of American society. One executive suggested, quote, the American capitalist system is confronting its darkest hour. If we don't take action now, we will see our own demise. We will evolve into another social democracy, end quote. Another bemoaned the role of Congress and stressed that business had to lead the country. Quote, it is up to each of us, not some prostitute of a congressman pandering to get reelected, to decide what should be done, end quote. They debated whether or not American democracy had gone too far, asking, quote, can we still afford one man, one vote? One man, one vote has undermined the power of business in all capitalist countries since World War II, end quote. Some discussed how to jolt the public out of its dependence on social welfare spending. Quote, the recession will bring about the healthy respect for the economic value that the Great Depression did. It would be better if the recession were allowed to weaken more than it will, so that we would have a sense of sobriety. We need a sharp recession, end quote. These insights from the steward of American business showcased concern, but also the lengths to which some capitalists were willing to go to reinvigorate their profits. These business leaders were not wholly confident in American politicians' ability to lead the economy. The challenge for Nixon was to restore confidence and profitability by quieting the decade-long social and political instability. Since the Black movement had been the nexus for social activism, would an attack on the Black movement have the same generalizing effect? This was a multi-pronged strategy that included physical repression of the movement through the use of expansion of the policing state, an ideological attack on the poor and working-class African Americans as undeserving, lazy, and violent, and eventually in the cultivation of a functioning Black middle class that could politically discipline poorer African Americans while also rehabilitating the idea that everyone could prosper in the United States. Freedom and choices. Nixon's first term functioned as a bridge between the civil rights era and the burgeoning period of post-racial colorblind political paradigms. The Nixon administration was reluctant to fully dismantle Johnson's programs, fearing that the cities would reignite, but it also was limited by the Democrats' control of Congress. Nixon worked to close the civil rights period not by being antagonistic, but by changing the terms of the debate. Where the Black movement had, as a result of protest and theorization, succeeded in defining racism as systemic and institutional, Nixon officials worked to narrow the definition of racism to the intentions of individual actors, while countering the idea of institutional racism by focusing on, quote, freedom of choice as a way to explain differential outcomes. Nixon made clear that his administration would fight against, quote, intentional racism, but differentiated this from disparate outcomes produced by institutional discrimination that was harder to identify. For example, Nixon and others called the division between rich and poor, quote, economic discrimination, but defended it, citing the right of property owners in particular to protect and maintain their property values by limiting the incursion of the poor into their communities, referencing the ongoing debate concerning the placement of low-income housing. but Nixon was addressing much larger issues as well. In a little discussed 1971 statement on housing, he spelled out the logic of post-civil rights, quote, colorblind paradigm. He says, "The goal of this administration is a free and open society. In saying this, I use the words, quote, free and, quote, open quite precisely. Freedom has two essential elements: the right to choose and the ability to choose. Similarly, an, quote, open society is one of open choices, and one in which the individual has the mobility to take advantage of these choices. An open society does not need to be homogeneous or even fully integrated. There is room within it for many communities. In terms of the open society, what matters is mobility. The right and the ability of each person to decide for himself where and how he wants to live, whether as part of the ethnic enclave or as part of a larger society, or as many do who share the life of both. We are richer for our cultural diversity. Mobility is what allows us to enjoy it. Instead of making man's decision for him, we aim to give him both the right and the ability to choose for himself and the mobility to move upward." He ended the statement by attempting to separate economic discrimination from racial discrimination. Quote, "What is essential is that all citizens be able to choose among reasonable locational alternatives within their economic means, and that racial non-discrimination be scrupulously and rigorously enforced. We will not seek to impose economic integration upon an existing local jurisdiction. At the same time, we will not countenance any use of economic measures as a subterfuge for racial discrimination." End quote. This statement bears all of the hallmarks of colorblind logic. From the absence of racial language, we are expected to infer the absence of racist action. The statement in its entirety ignores the effects of the recent past when it comes to discrimination, particularly in the housing market. There is no accounting for the ways in which historic patterns of housing discrimination, which had only legally ended 3 years prior to this statement, shaped the contemporary metropolitan geography. There is no recognition of how historic and contemporary discrimination sharply limited African Americans' economic choices. The statement deliberately lacks context and history, at the same time suggesting that neighborhood configurations were shaped by, quote, freedom, quote, choice, and cultural considerations, as opposed to redlining and racism. Nixon's emphasis on, quote, mobility and the ability to choose ignores the heated ongoing debate over the 1968 Fair Housing Act, or FHA. But this rhetoric and the political shift would fit nicely with the demands of the business elite. 3 years after the passage of FHA, when Nixon made this speech, the National Association of Real Estate Boards, the nation's largest association of real estate brokers, continued to oppose fair housing, referring to it as, quote, forced integration, end quote. This was not accidental language. It was part of a larger effect to reframe the political debates that went far beyond housing. By disconnecting the contemporary crisis from a history of racial discrimination encouraged by public policy acted upon throughout the U.S. private sector, Nixon was commenting more broadly about disparities between blacks and the rest of American society. In Nixon's world, a, quote, free and open society was more than enough. Poor choices were the only real constraint on the, quote, mobility to move upward. Quote, bad choices could produce a lifetime of poverty or crime.
Law and order under Nixon. Since the Truman administration, the theme of law and order had served a function in presidential governance. But the rise of the civil rights movement and then civil disorder gave new context and meaning for understanding crime, policing, and imprisonment. I explore these ideas more fully in Chapter 4. but for the purposes of this chapter, it is important to understand Johnson and Nixon's turn to law and order as a means of confronting the Black insurgency and recasting Black demands for justice as a pretext for ramping up the policing and prison state. To do this, Nixon picked up an earlier thread in conservative politics that conflated civil rights protests and Black demands with criminal activity. In a 1966 interview, for example, he said that the deterioration of respect for law and order can be, quote, traced directly to the spread of the corrosive doctrine that every citizen possesses an inherent right to decide for himself which laws to obey and when to disobey them, end quote. Nixon harnessed this logic along with pointing to rising crime rates and the notion that the United States was spiraling out of control as reasons to expand the powers and equipment of the criminal justice system dramatically. Johnson's Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act of 1968 was passed in the weeks after the murder of Martin Luther King Jr., which prompted hundreds of riots across the United States. The legislation capped Johnson's years of efforts to professionalize law enforcement around the country, where it had been racked by lack of training, coordination, and organization. This was certainly not simply about, quote, fighting crime. Despite the attention to rising crime rates, safe streets greatly enhanced local officials' intelligence gathering capacities, including wiretapping to, quote, protect the United States against the overthrow of the government by force or other unlawful means, or against any other clear and present danger to the structure or existence of the government, end quote. The bill also called for greater integration of the FBI into state and local law enforcement and a 10% budget increase to, quote, develop new or improved approaches, techniques, systems, equipment, and devices to improve and strengthen law enforcement, end quote. More generally, the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, a subsection of the Omnibus Crime Bill, was a conduit guiding federal resources towards states and cities to allow for more consistent approaches to police work. Indeed, within 10 years, the federal government was able to spend approximately $7.5 billion to beef up the nation's law and order apparatus in little more than a decade. Journalist Christian Parenti has pointed out the many specific ways the Nixon administration wielded the legal apparatus to harass and intimidate the left. For example, Nixon signed the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, into law in 1970 as part of a larger bill against organized crime, ostensibly to fight the influence of the mafia. The RICO legislation, however, could be just as quickly used against the left. For instance, the legislation, quote, loosened the rules pertaining to the use of illegally obtained evidence by prosecutors. It created new categories of federal crime. It allowed the federal government to seize assets of any organization deemed to be a criminal conspiracy. It created new penalties and policing power over the use of explosives, and finally, it created 25-year-long sentences for, quote, dangerous adult offenders, end quote. Using the new powers of RICO, the Nixon administration subpoenaed more than 1,000 anti-war activists, including leaders of Vietnam veterans against the war. Thousands of journalists, Black Panthers, and Puerto Rican nationalists were also forced to testify in grand jury hearings that were nothing but fishing expeditions to get information about the left. Surveillance as a crucial aspect of social control was a major component of the widening Nixon police state. Consider that in a matter of 4 years, the number of states with functioning, quote, criminal justice information systems mushroomed from 10 to 47. A $90 million investment allowed for greater integration of local systems with the FBI's master intelligence system, the National Crime Information Center, NCIC. When the NCIC was formed, its database had 500,000 pieces of information. But by 1974, it had collected 4.9 million entries. The growing policing state was not just an attack on the organized left, but it also directed at policing the, quote, unruly Black population. Most experts chart the beginning of the phenomenon called, quote, mass incarceration in the 1970s. Anti-Black policing and law and order rhetoric had a much earlier start, but the exponential growth of imprisonment and the turn toward hyper-punitive prison terms began after the Black Power uprisings of the 60s had ended. between the 80s and 90s, the chances of receiving a prison sentence following arrest increased by 50%, and the average length of sentence increased by 40%. As historian Heather Ann Thompson has pointed out, there were many markers highlighting the shifts in law enforcement over the 1960s and 1970s, but the vicious crackdown against a mostly Black uprising in the Attica prison in upstate New York was perhaps most indicative. Inmates in Attica took 42 prison staff members hostage to draw attention to their political demands to improve the quality of life in the prison, including improved sanitation, an end to guard brutality, better medical care, and better food, among many others. For 5 days, inmates negotiated in good faith with state officials, but on the morning of September 13th, 1971, the governor of New York, and this begins the quote of a pretty brutal description of violence against the Attica prison uprising and the murder of these people. So if anyone needs to if anyone needs to leave and join the breakout room, or if anyone needs to mute, I encourage you to do that, but I'm gonna continue reading and I'll give you a thumbs up if you stay after it's done. On the morning of September 13th, 1971, the governor of New York, quote, gave the green light for helicopters to rise suddenly over Attica and blanket it with tear gas. As inmates and hostages fell to the ground, blinded, choking, and incapacitated, more than 500 state troopers burst in, riddling catwalks and exercise yards with thousands of bullets. Within 15 minutes, the air was filled with screams, and the prison was littered with the bodies of 39 people, 29 inmates and 10 hostages, who lay dead or dying. Quote, I could see all this blood just running out of the mud and water, one inmate recalled. That's all I could see. That's the end of that. So I'm going to continue on. The brutal suppression of the Attica uprising was a way for law enforcement to act out of violent revenge against the same kinds of people who had rebelled on the outside. It was a way for the state to impose its authority in ways that it had been unable to in the hundreds of rebellions that had rocked the country throughout the 60s. Rockefeller used the state-led assault on Attica as an opportunity to, quote, take a hard line and rethink how he had been handling New York City's, quote, fringe elements, whether inmates, activists, or addicts. Determined to show conservatives in his party that he was tough on crime, Governor Rockefeller, quote, not only chose to put down the Attica rebellion with deadly force, but he publicly committed himself to certain, quote, enduring principles, such as society's need for law and order. Olivia, I'm going to bounce it off to you.
Thank you, Maya. New York State's Rockefeller drug laws also indicated the punitive turn in sentencing in the 1970s. After a 31% increase in drug-related arrests in the early 1970s, supposedly liberal-leaning Republican Nelson Rockefeller called for harsh sentences even for drug possession, including a mandatory minimum sentence of 15 years to life for 4 ounces of narcotics, the same sentence as for involuntary manslaughter. The effects were incontrovertible. Over the next 20 years, the proportion of drug offenders in New York's prison population grew from 11% in 1973 to a peak of 35% in 1994. In 1978, the state of Michigan tried to outdo New York by concocting the, quote, 650 to lifer law, which required judges to impose life sentences on anyone convicted of delivering 650 grams, less than 1.5 pounds, or more of narcotics. The effects of the growing policing and prison state were clear by the end of the decade. In 1970, the American prison population, including those in state and federal facilities, was 196,429, as small as it had been since 1958. But by 1980, it had grown to 315,974, the largest number of Americans ever imprisoned. In addition, while white people, then as now, were always the predominant group of drug users, the ever-expanding powers of the police were directed at the, quote, unruly Black and Latino neighborhoods where authority had broken down and whose activism and discontent were a constant source of tension. Nixon's turn to focusing on crime fit snugly with his broader use of colorblindness to champion his domestic policies. There was no need to invoke race in this campaign for law and order, but the consequences of the policies could not have been clearer. Crime was committed by bad people who made bad choices. It was not the product of an unequal social order that left Blacks and Puerto Ricans in particular isolated in urban enclaves with little access to good jobs, housing, or schools and a worsening economy. Instead, inequality left poor and working class people of color to their own devices to advance in a society that had made next to no provisions for them to do so through legal or normative means. These kinds of constrained, quote, choices were made in white enclaves as well, but those were less surveilled and less likely to be criminalized by the police and the criminal justice system as a whole. Elected officials' ability to manipulate and politicize crime was not wholly based on fiction. There was a surge in the numbers of crimes committed in the late 1960s and into the 1970s. Some of this had to do with a greater focus on counting crimes, including absorbing, quote, criminal acts committed in the midst of political rebellion into the overall numbers. The number of reported violent crimes grew from 161,000 in 1960 to 487,000 by 1978. There were also major fluctuations and variations in the numbers and locations of criminal activity over time and place. For example, homicides dropped by 4% from 1975 to 1978, as did property crimes. But what did not change was the propensity for African Americans to lead in virtually all categories as victims of crime. Over the course of the 1970s, a Black man's chance of being murdered was 6 to 8 times greater than that of a white man. Black families were more likely to be victims of burglary and car theft. Even Black middle-class families, because of their physical proximity to poverty, were much more likely to be victims of crime than their white peers. Politicians were quick to manipulate crime numbers that showed the disproportionate burden of Black communities as an excuse to expand the powers and reach of the policing state. They did so using public funds that were needed to develop the kinds of public institutions and civil infrastructure that could mitigate poverty and criminal activity. To be sure, this often meant that Black people were the ones to call on the state for greater protection from law enforcement. But this happened in a context where almost all the alternatives had been taken off the table. The crisis problem people. In 1973, Richard Nixon declared an end to the, quote, urban crisis. The significance of this was that the, quote, crisis in the cities, as Johnson had described it,
Uh-oh. Livia's frozen. Maya, have you been following?
Yeah, I can start over, or I can take over.
Yeah.
How do you switch back? The crisis problem people. In 1973, Richard Nixon declared an end to the urban crisis. The significance of this was that the crisis in the cities, as Johnson had described it, had been the catalyst for federal aid to American cities for much of the 1960s. But in the spring of 1973, several weeks before he was to offer a draconian budget that included suspending all federal housing subsidies, the president declared the urban crisis to be over. In a radio address, Nixon declared, quote, "A few years ago, we constantly heard that urban America was on the brink of collapse. It was 1 minute to midnight, we were told, and the bells of doom were beginning to toll. One history of America in the 1960s was even given the title Coming Apart. Today, America is no longer coming apart," end quote. Crisis magazine was much more skeptical than the president. An editorial replied, quote, "The rosy portrait of the State of the Union with its implications of a cool summer followed the unveiling of the president's alarming budget, and came 3 months before the summer vacation period during which hundreds of thousands of poor and unemployed ghetto youth will be released from school to roam the teeming streets of their quarters practically 24 hours a day," end quote. Nixon never mentioned any repair to or improvement in the conditions of urban dwellers, including African Americans. He also made no effort to quantify how the end of the urban crisis could be measured. An end to police brutality? An end to housing discrimination? What were the markers? Instead, he focused on the decline in the number of people living in substandard housing. That was an important marker, but it hardly spelled an end to the litany of problems outlined in the Kerner Commission report. Nixon was mostly interested in turning the page. He was not naively thinking that urban problems were now a thing of the past. He was extracting the federal government from its responsibility to resolve them. It had now been 5 long years since the last massive upheaval in a Black community, and Nixon seized the opportunity. The new attack on social spending was buttressed with descriptions of urban populations as either not truly in need or beyond the help of federal anti-poverty programs. The Nixon administration began to describe urban problems as being intractable because of the people who lived in the cities. In other words, where impoverished conditions still existed, it was time to look at what was wrong with those people. Nixon's new emphasis on the, quote, free society and, quote, choice was intended to reduce social inequality to individual behaviors. People, of course, could make right or wrong choices, but it was the individual, free of social constraints, doing the choosing. It was much easier to promote the idea of making do with less in the aftermath of the nation's longest economic expansion if the people being asked to make do with less were blamed for their own hardship. George Romney, Nixon's first secretary of the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, led the way in this shift by focusing on what he described as the, quote, crisis problem people. In 1973, in a speech to the Detroit Economic Club to explain the scandalous collapse of a federal housing program, Romney explained why government malfeasance and private institutional fraud were not the culprits. He said, quote, "With deep regret, the things that have gone wrong with the housing subsidy and insurance programs are my responsibility," end quote. He continued, quote, "Even if we had been able to avoid all of the mistakes and errors that have occurred in the housing programs, we would still be up against the larger tragedy, the crisis of people with problems in our central cities," end quote. He would later elaborate on who these, quote, people with problems were. Quote, "Housing by itself cannot solve the problems of people who may be suffering from bad habits, lawlessness, laziness, unemployment, inadequate education, low working skills, ill health, poor motivation, and a negative self-image," end quote. These phrases were codes for the Black poor living in the cities. This also showed how colorblindness worked against the interests of African Americans, not just in obvious ways, but as a pivot for attacking living standards and programs for all working class people. Nixon's declaration of the end of the urban crisis was not only a way to isolate poor urban Blacks, it also began ideologically undoing the post-war welfare state. Carl Albert, Democratic Speaker of the House, recognized Nixon's draconian 1973 budget as, quote, "nothing less than a systemic dismantling and destruction of great social programs and the great precedents of humanitarian government inaugurated by Franklin D. Roosevelt and advanced and enlarged by every Democratic president since then." Ryan, do you want to take over?
Yep, 1 second. Where is the thing? There it is. Historian Alice O'Connor has described the emergency of the neoconservative right in the 1970s as most interested in, quote, redefining the problem of urban crisis altogether along the lines earlier sketched out. Wait, hold on. Sorry. I'm going to restart. I got
Was this the
confused.
section that you had just finished? I thought the last thing you said was since then. No? Okay, sorry.
I think I'm
Yeah,
right.
Ryan should start at the very top of the page.
Okay.
So where am I? Sorry, I'm.
Says Albert.
Where it says Albert?
My. Oh, sorry.
Where do you see where it says Albert?
No. Can you keep going? Sorry.
Yeah. Where did the PDF go? Albert may have been engaging in some partisan hyperbole. It would take the swinging axe of Ronald Reagan to completely destroy the Johnson welfare state, but Nixon helped to establish the ideological groundwork for Reagan's project by systematically discrediting the people who relied upon the programs.
Now we can go.
All right. Sorry about that. Historian Alice O'Connor has described the emergence of the neoconservative right in the 1970s as most interested in, quote, redefining the problem of urban crisis altogether along the lines earlier sketched out in the Moynihan sensationalized 1965 report on the Negro family in the case for national action, end quote. Conservative intellectuals gathered in think tanks and journals to articulate this process of redefining. They went farther than how do you say that word?
Resuscitating.
Oh, it's a hard one. Resuscitating the, quote, culture of poverty, end quote, narrative, reaching back to earlier theories of biological racism. For example, one conservative described urban slums as, quote, human cesspools in which our worst human problems has flowed and in which, through some kind of bacterial action, a self-sustaining reaction has been created that is making matters worse despite the general improvement going on everywhere else, end quote. Another conservative author described urban rebellions as little more than, quote, outbreaks of animal spirits and of stealing by slum dwellers, end quote. Conclusion. It is important to understand, quote, colorblindness as much more than denial of racism. Colorblindness has become the default setting for how Americans understand how race and racism work. It is repeatedly argued that the absence of racial insult means that racial discrimination is not a play. Indeed, mere mention of race as a possible explanation or as a means of providing greater context, risk, accusation of, quote, playing the race card, end quote, a way of invoking race to silence disagreement. This is deployed to hide or obscure inequality and disparities between African Americans and whites. It has helped to elevate and amplify politics that blame blacks for their own oppression. Colorblindness is a critical weapon in the arsenal of the politically powerful and economic elite to divide those who have an interest in uniting to make demands on the state and capital to provide the means for a decent quality of life. Colorblindness is, quote, post-racial politics, are vested in false ideas that the United States is meritocratic society where hard work makes the difference between those who are successful and those who are not. The history described in this chapter concerning the rise in class struggle, the anxiety of the business elite, the onset of economic crisis within global capitalism, and how the convergence of those different factors created an opportunity to undo the welfare state of the previous period, and is the context within which we should understand the emergence of the concept of colorblindness. The looming threat of explosive cities, still palpable in the spring of 1974, with Nixon's draconian budget cuts, stopped a frontal attack on the social welfare programs of the 1960s. But instead, barely coded language focused on the poorest of blacks to explain the retreat from the cities as did Nixon's abrupt announcement declaring the end of the, quote, urban crisis. Nixon's abrupt most importantly, removing race and ultimately culpability for the conditions of the cities meant there was no explanation for those conditions beyond the people living there. If the culture was the issue, what was needed was personal transformation, not a robust public sector. All this prepared the ideological ground for the massive assault on social welfare that would come in the 1980s amid the so-called Reagan Revolution.
All right, and that ends chapter 2. That was a long one. So thank you all for listening.
That was really great and so interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to put some talking points in the chat and we can just have,
Thank you for all the readers. That was just, it was perfect. It was moving, just what we need right now.
Maya, I'm having trouble finding what's in the chat, but so it would be great if you might mention some of the talking points that you were thinking about. But I just was struck as I was listening about such a different meaning and approach to the term colorblind, which it seems to me when it first came out had a positive and a almost a sweetness about it, which is very, very different from what in fact this interpretation of history is projecting. So I found it fascinating.
Yeah, thanks for that, Louise. I'll read out some of the talking points. We also, don't have to use these, but Haymarket had put together some points that are helpful. So, what do the quotes from President Nixon and his chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman, tell us about the degree to which ruling classes perceive working class multiracial solidarity as a threat? Black people and other radicalized groups have a special potential to lead this kind of solidarity and radicalize a class movement through their leadership. To what degree can we understand racism as an elite project in response to this?
Yeah, I think that, oh, sorry.
No, you go.
I was going to say that the section where they're like the graduate students like infiltrate the like business associates big meeting and just like the fear of solidarity amongst the working class and this fear of just a change in the status quo and a change in policies that would be a real threat to their interests. I mean, that part was so striking and really, really evocative of current moments and current fears you hear being expressed.
One of the things, Maya, that I was very struck with the reading is how much the Nixon administration, really set up a situation of divide and conquer, which was a phrase that the writer said at one point. And that seems to me to be just a really crucial point. How can we all, act together? And we need to think in terms of solidarity across class, race, gender, and that seems to me to be a really key point.
Yeah.
The divide and conquer strategy so benefits the people at the top.
Connected to the importance of solidarity, I thought that the third question in the talking points was interesting about, is democracy under capitalism necessarily limited and vulnerable to being rolled back? Because I think that a lot of rollbacks in like participant government have been seen recently with the crackdown on protests. And also in terms of capitalism being like the guiding force in that crackdown, I think that a lot of the resistance to abolition today is related to just people being afraid that their paychecks are in jeopardy rather than like thinking about human life. They just are like afraid of losing their jobs because, and I think a big part of that is that their jobs are tied up in like their whole humanity, and that the government isn't trying to like lead the charge on envisioning ways to give people other jobs that would protect life instead of like being focused on destroying it.
It seems to me that because of thinking about divide and conquer, it seems to me that what's operative here, as it has been, I think, throughout recorded history, as I can tell, is a concept of us versus them. And you would divide and conquer them because they're not us. And that is really antithetical to the concept of democracy, because democracy is based on all people being equal. It's a pretty idea, right? But it's an idea that people have a hard time accepting, because it seems like what we see normally is that for one person to succeed, another has to fail. And I don't have an answer, but I'm just pointing out like sort of like operative principles or operative human tendencies and understanding. And I keep thinking that there has to be a paradigm shift in the way we look at democracy and what it means, and are we truly intending to be a democracy? Or are we just tossing the ball back and forth between us and them all the time?
When you think of other definitions of freedom and openness, that would require a fundamental social foundation, then what?
Not hearing you, Maya.
I was just reading out another question that is, can you think of other definitions of freedom and openness that would require a fundamentally different social foundation than what Nixon's held?
Well, people have to be willing to listen to each other, and there has to be an absence of suppression of news and facts and truth. You know, as long as there are powers that be that suppress people's expressing their points of view, there will be suppression of bodies and groups of people. I don't have an answer for any of this stuff, but it's power is pursuit of power is not a good thing.
I think that kind of a version of us versus them is happening today that I don't know if it was really happening back in the 1960s. Or it was, but I don't know if it was happening as much. But today, you divide and conquer, I think, is largely based around news media and where people get their information. And, you know, if you think of Democrat versus Republican, there's, you know, stereotypical places that people get their information, and that is a huge way to divide right now. And that probably has roots in racism that we read about tonight. But I think that's something that's happening today that is very present happening. You know, it's a newer form of dividing.
There used to be a very good newspaper out of Boston called the Christian Science Monitor, which was not a religious newspaper. But it was probably I remember doing research. We had a report to do in high school, and I remember reading all these newspapers, and it came to the conclusion it was the most unbiased, unsensational news that there is. And that's all we really want in news, is just give us the facts. I don't want to hear about all these opinions. I really don't. Because especially if they're inflammatory. And CNN is so bad at that.
I want to go back to Maya. You pulled that question about Nixon's definition of freedom from the talking points, and I think that's a really interesting one, because I think the question also presumes that Nixon genuinely meant something about freedom and genuinely believed in people having freedom. But I think that his real stance, a lot similar to many American politicians and past presidents, is that he doesn't really want people to be free. And if he had had his way, fewer people would have been able to vote and would still be able to vote. I think that that's kind of a lie that we tell ourselves in maintaining our democracy or our republic, is that people in power want everyday people to have sway. And I think that if we look back to the origins of the American Republic, they never really wanted everyday people to have that sway. So it's an interesting lie that we've upheld for hundreds of years, that we're this great place where everyone has a vote and has a voice, but really that was never the intention.
Well, that was one of the issues about, the original democracy in Greece, that, it only actually entailed 2,000 people who were the property owners, and they were men and they were all slave owners. So, so I mean, the problem with democracy as it's been conceived is it's never really very well been enacted.
Correct. That's correct.
Talk to them. I can't talk to you and.
You talk to me.
No, but I'm talking to the camera.
Oh, sorry.
We have to go. We've got to meet a friend for dinner, but thank you. That was a very good reading, Maya. Thank you.
Bye, you guys. Great to have you.
Bye. Great to see you.
I have a question. I don't have the text, but at the part of the beginning where it talks about when Nixon was elected, and it was talking about, could you read that little section where it was talking about a turn towards conservatism? Because, nothing, no names or anything were new. This is all very familiar, but of course the way the story was told was really great. But I just remember, you know, the top when Nixon was a candidate and who he was running against and all that, and you know, coming from a family that was planning to vote for Kennedy at the time, it was kind of surprising to hear that there was this, you know, general assumed conservative turn in the country.
So you wanted us to read.
Right at the beginning, there was like a sentence about how there was a conservative turn in the country, and that's why he got elected, to protect something.
So she also talks about ultimately Reagan lost the nomination to Gerald Ford by a narrow margin, but the trajectory of mainstream politics was clear. It was not just the right. The Democratic Party was also moving quickly to abandon its very recent association with the civil rights movement. Was that it, or a different
No,
part?
that's not it, but that also hit the same, you know, that was a good, that I noticed that too, yeah, along the same thing. It was at the beginning, as we're talking about when Nixon got elected, because I, you know, being like having grown up then and remembering like kind of Nick alluded to this too, this, you know, great movement of like, you know, the hippies were on every street corner hitchhiking, and that looked great, and like there was this feeling of a great movement then, you know, which was much more attractive to me as a child. And so I didn't really realize that there was this huge concern. Of course, it was horrible and frightening in our family when Nixon did get elected, or not yet, but anyway, just that there was like this, the accepted idea that the country was moving far to the right at that point.
I guess it's also, you know, as a historian, like, you know, she's trying to figure out how did we get to Reagan so quickly, kind of. So it's probably, you know, looking at the trends and what was set up to get there in just a couple of years.
Yeah, well, you know, when Nixon was governor of California, and even before that, when Reagan was, and when he was, you know, an up and coming politician, like the year that I was born, I didn't get a middle name because of him. It was going to be Reagan, but I just didn't get one.
Quote you were looking for, Roxanne.
Yeah.
Richard Nixon's victory in 1968 signaled that not everyone was pleased with the radicalism sweeping across the United States. Nixon articulated the anxiety experienced by many white workers who chafed at the pace at which blacks were demanding change. He especially embodied the anger of a ruling class that wanted to reestablish control over the direction of the country. This meant ending street protests as well as curtailing public sector programs and work. The reassertion of Republican control began with binding the loose threads of the party. And then it continues talking about the divided.
That's exactly it. And that's, you know, that's one of those heartbreaks, like, you know, 3 years ago, almost 4 years ago, one of those huge, like, wake up heartbreaks.
It's pretty stunning how similar the language is to what we hear today. I mean, we didn't learn much.
Yeah.
Oh, hi, I'm Lisa. I wanted to share something that I didn't know from the reading. I didn't know that there was a huge postal strike and that the National Guard was called in and all of these things. And I just found it interesting that right now, one of the things that they're trying to get rid of is our postal services, is the United Postal Service. So it kind of makes me wonder, like, what's that all about? And like, what's the connection there? Does anyone, did that, I don't know, does that strike anything with anyone or?
Well, certainly a piece of it is that the Postal Service has a very large number of Black employees. And it is considered a very good job within that community. So let's just take it away.
I also found it striking because I vaguely remember that strike, but I also found it surprising that I didn't remember when it wasn't a good job, and that's what it talks about a lot, about the fight for it to become a good job. But that was surprising.
The contrast between the Congress is raising its own salary 41%, and the postal workers 4%, and the big victory being 14%, is outrageous. And I do remember how exciting it was that they got this big victory. Look what we're calling a big victory. It's amazing.
It's also interesting seeing that strike to obviously a very different situation, but the prisoners at, what was it, Atticus?
Attica.
Attica, that the only expression that they felt they had was to hold hostages, but they were met with being killed. You know, it's such a, I don't know, juxtaposition.
Since you brought that up, was it, because I'm not familiar with the Atticus uprising, and when they went in with helicopters, did they then just indiscriminately kill everyone, like hostages, prisoners, all of them? We don't even care about the hostages. We're just going to kill everyone and shut it down. I mean,
Yeah.
that's kind of mind-boggling and
10 of the 39 people,
scary.
yeah, 10 of the 39 people that were killed were the hostages. It's just like,
Yeah.
so what
How do you
happened?
just go in there and we're going to kill everyone?
Yeah.
The Attica uprising is really important. Maybe we should, the syllabus is full, but I mean, maybe we should have a discussion about it.
What was the year of that?
71, was it, or 69? Attica?
71.
Yeah. Does anybody understand why there's never been a dialogue? Speaking of equities and inequities, does anybody ever wonder why there's never a dialogue about the compensation of the Congress and the Senate, and the fact that it's for life and that they have better medical care than we do on Medicare or on any of, Obamacare? I mean, these are facts, but does anybody really think about and have an explanation by why we don't have a dialogue about that and bring that forward?
We have lots and lots of efforts to bring it to bring it out, and they all fizzle. It comes up consistently, and it just never gains a lot of traction.
I also think that conversation, yeah, there is lots of talk about it, but it's also in the same camp as the Electoral College. There's so much reason to change the system, but it's also so hard to change the system that we have. So it always, like Louise says, fizzles out.
I'd like to go back to Attica because I think one of the things that's fascinated me and concerned me and irked me is, and the reason that I asked what the date of the Attica prison riot was, is the privatization of prisons. And it's amazing that it's not being called out what a big business it is. And I was, as you were reading, I was looking up when that started, and really the huge increase in private prisons started in 1980. And it's just gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. And it's interesting that it's more and more and more Black people being thrown in and given longer and longer sentences. And there's no motivation. The government is not going to save money or take it on that business uh, by reducing the prison population. It's like cutting into any other private business, and that is really not getting much attention. And I don't know why not. And I think in the current environment that it may or it should.
Yeah. Our last two readings were from Angela Davis's Are Prisons Obsolete? And they were the first couple chapters. And Louise, I'm not sure if you've had the chance to read those before, but
I didn't.
It's super informative on
Super helpful.
that issue, and you know, specifically tracking when prison, you know, the real prison industrial complex got its foot in the door. And definitely
Reagan
reading.
Is it Reagan that
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, him.
Californians?
It was that leading into Bill Clinton. Up to Bill Clinton, he did some very, very horrible things in office. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm really excited for a lot of the readings that we're going to do because, you know, we're just going to be learning a lot about these issues and feel really informed. And that, you know, I haven't had the opportunity to read a lot of the texts that are on the syllabus, and I'm just really looking forward to, because yeah, there's so much history that's not told and so much that's kept under wraps. And the texts are out there, you know, that it's written. We just, now it's like the time to really go through. But Angela Davis is amazing.
Yes, I got to read that. I think it's time for me to say goodnight all. This was fascinating. I'm sorry I missed the earlier ones. I just read the first memo wrong and went to something else, but it's very exciting to be a part of this. So thank you.
Good to see
See
you.
you next week.
Bye,
Love
Louise.
you. Bye-bye.
Yeah, I'm really curious for the readings in the future too, because I was reading an interview with Ruth Wilson Gilmore the other day, who's a prison abolitionist, and she was talking about how, I think this was in this interview with her that I read this, that she thought one of the faults of 13th, the documentary, was that it focused too much on private prisons, which are terrible, but actually, you know, a small percentage. Like if we ended all private prisons, there would still be a huge amount of people incarcerated. So it's just, you know, interesting, and I'm curious to read just all from so many different sides, how this prison abolition has to be looked at and discussed and dissected, because like just talking about private prisons leaves most people still incarcerated in the US.
Thanks for mentioning that. I'm going to put in the chat a podcast I recently listened to with Ruth Wilson.
I listened to it too. It's so good. Yeah.
She's amazing. So I'll put that in there if anyone's wanting to listen. Maybe Livia, if you want to post that article too.
Yeah, I will.
Thank you for the research that you've been doing and the bibliography you've put together. It's really great. Thank you.
Thank you.
I really hate to leave this conversation, but I have to go eat dinner. And thank you, everybody. And thank you so much for the meetings. I'm so enjoying it. Thanks.
Great to see you, Roxanne.
Night, Roxanne.
Night, Roxanne.
It's also 11:30 for us on the East Coast, which Ryan just mentioned that we were going to ask folks tonight how they feel about starting at 5 o'clock, right? We had said. Is that good?
Sorry, California folk.
For California, yeah.
Yes, for those on Pacific Standard.
Starting at 5:30?
Oh,
How
yeah.
Wait.
How about 5:30?
Yeah,
Okay.
that works. Does that work for everyone?
Yeah. Yeah, let's do it. Let's try it next week at 5:30 Pacific time.
Wait, what had you said originally, Maya? Sorry,
Oh, I had said 5, but 5:30 works just fine.
5 works for me as well.
I have something in the afternoon, and it was hard for me to get here by 6:30, but it would be great if it could be 5:30.
5:30.
Let's try 5:30. We can always adapt, but that lets Maya and Ryan get out a little bit earlier, and also people who are eating dinner afterwards in California.
That's
do
great.
that.
Thank you.
Thank you. See you at 5:30 next time.
5:30.
Thank you.
Thank you
so
very
That
much.
was wonderful.
I want to thank you, everybody. My name is Luz Oyer, and I couldn't put the chat. I'm not. This is new for me, but thank you. Thank you. Amazing.
Thank you for coming, Luz.
Yes, thank you so much.
Yeah, so happy to have you.
Oh, thank you. You guys are beautiful. Thank you.
Lovely to hear your voice.
I'm also leaving, so thank you, everyone. It's very nice
Bye,
to
Melinda.
see you. Yeah, thank you for all the reading, hard work, and interesting thoughts and information. So, till next week.
Till next week.
Yeah. Have a good week.
Yeah, you too.
Bye, everybody. Great reading. Thanks. So hard to read.
I put the
Bye,
quote also that I was talking about. Oh.
No, it's okay. We're both gonna go.
Bye.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
How did that length of reading feel for those who are still? Was that too much?
No, it felt great.
It was perfect. It was great. I could have listened more.
Okay.
Really. And especially because you do such a good job of it.
It's a great book. I got it on Audible, so I've been listening while I drive around.
That's good.
Yeah, it's good. And if you use Audible, you can exchange books.
You can?
Yeah, so you get credits. Like when you're done with the book, you can turn it back in and then get another one.
I didn't know that.
So I just thought that her scholarship was really professional,
She's amazing.
incisive.
Pretty mind-blowing.
And even the preface in the first chapter, she asked so many good questions. Like I hadn't really, she wrote this during the Obama era, which is also kind of mind-boggling, which seems like 25 years ago. Like all of a sudden, Nixon and Reagan seem like yesterday because we're kind of living in that. But Obama seems like so long ago.
Yeah.
So the fact that she was writing this, it just definitely really hit me about her point about you'd think that when you have an African American president, that racism would be over.
Right, right.
But in fact, there was this huge acceleration in racism, and she kind of draws this kind of economic point about the growing affluent group of African Americans and the disparity between the affluent African Americans and the lower income African Americans growing during the Obama era. I think largely because of access to privilege just kind of accelerated for a few. But I didn't finish the book. I only got to the end of this chapter, but I just thought the way positioning her in Obama era and her sort of eagerness to contextualize racism and economics and the prison industrial system was really, really good. And she's also very cool about it all. Like she's very scholarly. So
Yeah, just the facts. Just the facts.
I so admire those kind of thinkers, you know, just she's
Yeah.
really, and it was great to have her after Angela Davis. Who are we reading next week?
I was just going to say really quickly, it's funny you saying that, you know, she's from the Obama era and everything, because I just remembered, because I actually heard her introduce Angela Davis and interview Angela Davis in Chicago. And it was, I'm just remembering now, it was a couple days after Trump had won.
Oh.
And so it was like she was supposed to be interviewing Angela Davis about her new book. And then, you know, they were just talking about like what the current moment means and how they hadn't expected it, but of course they also did. And yeah, I'm just remembering that was like right when Trump had won.
Next, we're going to be reading Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow.
That was also written in the Obama era too, which is
okay.
Well, we're obviously just reading a chapter from it, but that's the next author is Michelle Alexander, another amazing Black femme author. And all of these books are worth finishing, obviously. Like, just these chapters are like just the surface of, like, you know, so much incredible.
Yeah, you did such a good job curating, Maya.
Really, really.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. I'm gonna head out now.
Too. Have a good night.
good time for us.
Have a good job, you guys.
Bye. Love you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Night.
Good night. Good night.